So, when you hear the word incel, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For a lot of us, it's probably news headlines about violence and extremism. But, that's a really specific and, honestly, a very small piece of a much bigger, more complicated picture. In this explainer, we're going to push those headlines to the side for a minute and really dig into what the largest ever scientific study of this community actually found. All right, let's get into it.
And look, let's be real, the reason this topic is even on the radar in a security context is because of a few very high-profile and absolutely tragic attacks. This quote from a UK government report pretty much sums up the story that brought this whole online world into the mainstream. It's a story of violence and misogyny, and it has, for very good reason, set off a lot of alarm bells.
But that all begs a pretty huge question, right? Is the person behind the violent headline the whole story? Who are the actual individuals behind this label? And maybe most importantly, what does the science say actually pushes someone from feeling frustrated to adopting genuinely harmful beliefs? That's exactly what we're here to unpack.
To get some real answers, we're diving into this massive study that was commissioned by the UK government. Researchers surveyed 561 self-identified incels from the US and the UK, which makes it the biggest and most detailed dataset we've ever had. And what it shows us is, well, it's a lot more complex and, frankly, a lot more surprising than the stereotypes would have you believe.
Okay, so first up, let's just paint a picture with the data. Who are the people who make up this community? The demographic and psychological numbers from the study really start to challenge some of our most common assumptions.
Let's start with this one. Get this. A common stereotype is that the incel community is this exclusively white subculture, right? But the data? It tells a completely different story. In this big sample from the US and UK, 42% of the guys who identified as incels were people of color.
And here's another huge stereotype we gotta talk about: the politics. The narrative you always hear links this community to the far right. But again, the data says something else. When researchers actually measured their positions on real-world policies, things like immigration or government spending, the average incel actually landed slightly to the left of center. The study also did something for the first time. It looked at neurodiversity using clinical screening tools, and what it found was pretty staggering. Almost a third of the participants scored above the cutoff for a medical referral on an autism spectrum questionnaire. To put that in perspective, that's a rate about 8 times higher than what you'd find in the general population.
But this next number is maybe the most gut-wrenching piece of data in the entire report. 1 out of every 5 incels surveyed had thought about suicide nearly every single day in the 2 weeks just before they took the survey. This points to a community that is in a state of profound mental health crisis.
So what we have is a surprisingly diverse group of men, a lot of whom are clearly struggling with their mental health. So what's the glue that holds them together? It's a really powerful ideology, a worldview that takes all that personal pain and suffering and turns it into a political story about being a victim.
And at the absolute center of that ideology is something they call the black pill. It's basically a philosophy of complete and total hopelessness. It says that a man's worth, his ability to ever find a partner, is totally decided by things he can't change, like his height, his jawline, you name it. In this worldview, trying to improve yourself is just pointless because the whole game was rigged against you from the day you were born.
And to back this up, they have these pseudo-scientific ideas like the 80-20 rule. This is the belief that 80% of women are all chasing after only the top 20% of men, these alpha males they called chads, and that leaves everyone else, the so-called genetically inferior, completely locked out of the dating world. And who do they blame for this? Feminism, for giving women, in their view, way too much power to choose.
Now, you might be thinking, why on earth would anyone adopt an ideology that just makes them feel so hopeless? And that's a great question. This quote from a Europol report just nails the answer. Even though the ideology makes them anxious and depressed, it does something really important for them psychologically. It takes all the blame for their loneliness and puts it on something else, on women, on society, on genetics. And because it gives them an explanation, a reason for their pain, it becomes incredibly sticky. It's just really, really hard to let go of.
Okay, so this brings us to the most important question of all. Given this really complex mix of factors, what actually predicts whether someone will develop harmful attitudes? We're talking about extreme misogyny, believing in rape myths, or even justifying violence. What's the dividing line between someone who's just suffering and someone who might actually cause suffering? To figure this out, the researchers basically looked at 3 big puzzle pieces. First, the severity of a person's mental health problems. Second, how strongly they bought into that whole black pill ideology. And third, how much time they were spending online, networking in these incel forums.
And this, right here, is the absolute key finding. You really need to hear this. While all three of those factors were linked to harmful attitudes, they were not all created equal. The study found that the combination of poor mental health and a strong belief in the ideology was more than twice as powerful at predicting harm as just spending time online was. Let me say that again. Mental health plus ideology was over double the predictor of harm compared to just being on the forums.
And this is where you can see how this becomes this brutal, vicious cycle, right? The study found it's a two-way street. Being deeply depressed and anxious makes the black pill ideology seem a lot more believable. And then, the more you believe in that hopeless worldview, the worse your mental health gets. They just feed off each other, creating this downward spiral that's really hard to escape.
So what does all this mean for actually stopping harm before it happens? Well, the data gives us some pretty clear clues about where we should be focusing our attention, especially when we're talking about that small minority who actively support the idea of violence.
First, let's be really clear about the numbers here. When they were asked if violence against people who harm incels is ever okay, a huge majority, 3/4 of them, said never or rarely. But there's a pretty concerning chunk, about a quarter, who said sometimes or often. In that group who said often, they're a very small slice of the pie, just about 5.5% of the people surveyed.
Now, what's really useful is that the study lets us build a data-driven profile of this high-risk 5%. So who are they? Well, compared to other incels, they are way more likely to have hostile views of women, to spend time planning revenge, to feel like they're being discriminated against, and to have even worse mental health. And, super interesting, this is the one specific group where leaning to the political right was actually a key distinguishing factor.
So, what's the ultimate takeaway from all this? If there's one thing to remember, it's this. The problem isn't just the internet. Yeah, the online forums are the place where these ideas get shared, but they aren't the root cause. This research makes it pretty clear that any effort to fix this that only focuses on policing websites without getting at the real drivers, which are severe mental distress and the powerful pull of an ideology that blames everyone else, is probably going to fail.
And all of this leaves us with a final and pretty tough question. The data shows us a very clear pathway. When you have profound personal suffering and it gets filtered through a powerful story that gives you someone to blame, that can lead to really dangerous places. The challenge for all of us, then, is how do we effectively address that suffering, and how do we dismantle that narrative of blame before it ever gets to the point of harm?